Welcome back, everybody. I promised my next video would be about the Arctic Ocean, but I had a few colleagues ask me about the bogus ocean suffocation crises that are being pushed by the media. About a week ago, the Seattle Times had the big headlines that low oxygen levels in the Pacific Northwest were a silent climate change crisis. And this is nothing new. This suffocation crisis has been pushed for at least the last 5 years. 2016, one media headlines said that the oceans would suffocate by 2030. The New York Times has also pushed this idea that the oceans are rapidly losing their oxygen. And they do this because it's clickbait and it's profitable. Not only did the New York Times push this headline, but they took out a Google ad to push this crisis type headline. So all the media is pushing this, and it doesn't make any sense. Now, the IUCN is the International Union of Conservation of Nature, and there's a lot of good scientists that I really appreciate that are trying to protect the environment, but they're also dependent on donations, and so they are not immune to trying to push a crisis in order to get more funding. Now, they just recently pushed this de-oxygenation. It's a wake-up call for our suffocating seas, and they blame climate change for causing a dramatic loss in life-sustaining oxygen. And they attributed it to three main causes. One, they said that CO2 is causing a warming of the ocean, and warmer waters lose oxygen quicker. They blame stratification, that warming surface layers prevent vertical mixing of water, and so that prevents oxygen from the atmosphere from reaching deeper layers. And they push eutrophication, which has nothing to do with climate change, but they pushed it in. So I want to talk about eutrophication first. Now, dead zones in the oceans due to eutrophication has been a known problem for several decades now. And many places are attempting to try to resolve this problem. What happens is that the dumping of nutrients from agricultural waste or sewage into the rivers enters the oceans, and all these nutrients create a boom in algae growth. But once the algae growth stops and it dies, the decay consumes all the oxygen. And without oxygen, the fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico would see that these dead zones, seen in red, all the fish would leave. And so it was a crisis. And this is not just happening at the Gulf of Mexico, but all these little red spots here represent the places around the world. And we see it's usually around major population zones where this waste are being dumped into the ocean. This has nothing to do with climate change, but it's something we definitely must deal with. It's a problem. So the IUCN is arguing that since the 1960s, the global oceans have lost about 2% of their oxygen. And they blame it on global warming, kind of sprinkling this bogus climate crisis with a little bit of truth of physics, saying that as the water warms, it holds less oxygen. But this ignores the real issues. Now, Dr. Francisco Chavez is a Peruvian oceanographer who is now a chief science at the Monterey Bay Aquarium's Research Institute. And he looked at the effects of upwelling along the coast of Peru on oxygenation of the waters. And he did this, he looked at the data from over 700 years, and during the Little Ice Age, the waters were much colder, and that period of time is shaded in a light blue. And during that time, the waters were highly oxygenated. Then around 1800, as the water started to warm and the global temperature started to warm, the amount of oxygen in the water dropped. And this at first glance would seem like it's consistent with the global warming theory. But if you look deeper, you see the real significance has to do with upwelling. Chavez looked at how much nutrients were found in the upper levels of the water, and they noticed that what happened is the earth warmed coming out of the Little Ice Age, upwelling increased. That brought nutrients up to the surface where plankton could grow. And what you see then is when that happened, there was this tremendous amount of productivity that's happened. So the warming we've experienced over the last 100 years has been a great benefit to the whole marine ecosystems. Now you'd expect from this extra photosynthesis that the photosynthesis produces oxygen, and that would create more oxygenated waters. But there's another issue. Just like the eutrophication, when those particles, those organic matter that are created during photosynthesis start to sink and decay or be digested, they consume oxygen. In a recent paper in 2018 that created a spurt of media climate crisis claims, the paper was in 2018. Chavez was a co-author, but saying declining oxygen in the global ocean and the coastal waters. And they've made notes saying it's an important paradox to consider, that the large-scale effects of future de-oxygenation is that nutrient-rich coastal systems, due to upwelling areas, are associated with oxygen minimum zones, but they also support some of the world's most prolific fisheries. Now, at first glance, it appears that there's a great paradox here, that greater amounts of photosynthesis would cause a greater depletion of oxygen. But if you understand that the more photosynthesis, it creates more organic matter in these upwelling zones, and the more organic matter that's produced, it decays and consumes oxygen, and it's in these upwelling zones that we see the greatest oxygen minimum zones. Here, if we look at a global illustration of oxygen minimum zones around the world, we see in dark blue, where there's the greatest amount of upwelling, are the greatest places of oxygen minimum zones. If we look at this illustration about oxygen concentrations as we drop in depths through the ocean, we see at the very surface that the oxygen concentrations are at their highest. But that's in just the top 100 meters of the ocean. And below that, as photosynthesis drops, we see that the oxygen begins to be consumed as organic matter sinks. And by the time it reaches about 1 kilometer depth, we create these oxygen minimum zones where all this decaying organic matter consumes most of the oxygen. And then once you drop below those oxygen minimum zones, the oxygen in the water starts to increase again. And that's because there's very little organic matter left to decay, in the mixing of deep cold waters that have highly oxygenated, brought from more polar regions, start to add oxygen to the water. Now, to understand why this 100-meter depth marks the difference between supersaturated oxygen in the surface layers and a declining amount of oxygen below that, we have to understand how light penetrates the water. And here in this illustration, we see the sunlight is broken up into its basic colors of wavelengths. And we see that red light, which is really critical for photosynthesis, really doesn't penetrate past the first 1 meter. Infrared that is produced by greenhouse gases can't penetrate any deeper than about 1 micron, so it doesn't warm the oceans directly. By the time you get to 10 meters, the yellow light can't penetrate any deeper. Green light can't penetrate much deeper than 50 meters. And blue light, which is another critical wavelength for photosynthesis, can't penetrate any deeper than 100 meters. Now, this is an average. Sometimes very clear water, you get a little greater penetration. Murky waters, you have a little bit of less. But so we can break up in a very general way. We'll call the upper surface layer the euphotic zone, is where there's enough sunlight to foster photosynthesis. And then below the euphotic zone, you get a little bit less light in the dysphotic, but not enough for photosynthesis, and the aphotic is no light whatsoever. But in those regions, without photosynthesis, decay and digestion dominate, and oxygen is consumed, and oxygen minimum zones are created. So let's look at the paradox of why upwelling zones not only create the most abundant areas of rich and diverse marine life, but they can also cause some deadly consequences. Below the euphotic zone, where there's no photosynthesis, decay and digestion dominate. They consume all the oxygen. As they do that, they release all these nutrients that can now be recycled in the surface above. Now, the winds, and this happens typically along the west coast of all the continents, as they blow towards the equator, they cause the water to move away from the coast, and this causes the subsurface water to rise and replace it. As that water rises, this water without oxygen will cover some of the seafloor nearer the surface where invertebrates live, but if some of the fish, if they can move away, will do so because of the lack of oxygen, but other invertebrates that aren't so mobile might die. And this was first noticed by crab fishermen in Oregon when they brought up their crab pots and found dead crabs in it. But the upwelling now has all these nutrients. It injects nutrients into the euphotic zone. And this enables a burst of photosynthesis in these phytoplankton blooms that are now the basis for the whole food chain for this very robust ecosystem. And at the same time, because photosynthesis dominates, it supersaturates the surface waters with oxygen. Now, the second thing that the promoters of a climate crisis push is this idea of stratification, meaning that the water on the surface is warmer and won't mix with the colder water below it. And so they're arguing that CO2 warming is going to increase the stratification. Now, anyone that has studied oceans or lakes understands that this kind of stratification happens every summer, and it breaks down every winter. But this is sort of the sprinkling of scientific truth used to kind of make this bogus climate crisis narrative seem more plausible. So let's look at a peer-reviewed study from 2015 that examines the oxygen profile throughout a full year and through the seasons from summer to winter. This is from a station near Alaska, around 50 degrees latitude north. And what you can see here is the blues are regions below the surface that are unsaturated in oxygen, meaning that at that temperature, these waters could hold a lot more oxygen than they do, but they don't because of decay and digestion. The yellow and the reds show areas of supersaturation, meaning there's far more oxygen in those surface waters than you would expect to diffuse in from the atmosphere. The purple thick line shows the stratification and how it changes throughout the season. So if we look at the summer from June through October, when the waters are warm, we see that the strata is definitely very shallow. But we also see this is a region where there is supersaturation. And often this shallow stratification enables greater photosynthesis because it prevents this turbulence that can carry phytoplankton down to deeper depths with less light. As we move into the winter, the early fall and late spring, in the colder temperatures, we see this stratification gets deeper. But we also see there's much less oxygen in there, even though you have this deeper strata. And lots of the water now, because it's mixing, brings up this unsaturated water. So this deeper this deeper mixing of water is not always a benefit for supplying oxygen. And if we look at the waters below 100 meters, where decay and digestion dominate and get rid of the oxygen, we see this unsaturated water is really not affected that much by the changes in the stratification above it. So if you understand the science, if you understand the marine systems, you understand that there is no climate change de-oxygenation crisis. That when people are trying to manipulate your opinions, it's easy to mix in a small fraction of truth, a small fraction of science, with a large fraction of lies. And pushing an earth crisis makes people afraid, makes them concerned, makes them willing to accept different solutions that are pushed by politicians or create clickbait. And you must be aware of this vicious cycle of exaggerated crises. The media will promote click-based crises for a profit. And then politicians and researchers seeking funds will claim that they have solutions for these non-existent crises. Beware. Now, as promised before, my next video will be about how Arctic Ocean ventilation biases the global average temperature. But until then, embrace the renowned scientist Thomas Huxley's advice that skepticism is your highest of duties and blind faith is the one unpardonable sin. And if you appreciate the science clearly presented here, science rarely presented in mainstream media, then please give it a like, share, or copy the URL and email it to your friends. Subscribe to this YouTube channel, or read my book, Landscapes and Cycles, An Environmentalist Journey to Climate Skepticism. Thank you.